Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from the True Stories collection, as in, it actually happened at an event I was actually judging. You know, a common phenomenon I've noticed in a lot of formats is that there will be a handful of specific cards that generate the most rulings. I'm not sure whether this is true for the format as a whole, but there certainly was one standout card at the first CEDH event that I judged last weekend, and if you saw the title or the thumbnail, you know exactly which card I'm talking about. There are a few special things about Mindbreak Trap that work a little bit differently from some other cards with similar effects, so let's take a look at exactly how this card functions. The first thing that we'll notice is that it's free. Obviously, this is one of the factors that makes this card a popular choice compared to other counter effects that are available. One kind of interesting thing is that it says you can pay 0 rather than its mana cost, instead of saying you can cast it without paying its mana cost, like, for example, what we see on Patrician Scorn. I couldn't think of any functional difference between these two templates. I think the one on Patrician Scorn is the default, but Mindbreak Trap got the one that it did to sync it up with all the other trap cards, many of which have a non-zero alternative cost. Remember that even if you pay an alternative cost like this, the mana cost and mana value of the spell are unaffected, and will still be whatever they are normally. And we can see that alternative cost, it applies as long as an opponent casts 3 or more spells this turn. So a couple of important things to notice about the way that that's worded. First up, it keys off spell casting. They do not have to have resolved. So Mindbreak Trap would be free if you were going to use it against the third spell, for example. And next, it needs to be one specific opponent that casts 3 spells. 3 opponents casting 1 spell each does not count. On the other hand, if 2 opponents each cast 3 spells, Mindbreak Trap would be free, even though it might be a little bit confusing because it says if an opponent, and that maybe makes it seem like you would need to have exactly 1. There isn't anywhere that spells this out in the CR, but that is how it works. If a card effect looks for a specific number but won't proc if there are too many, you expect the template to call that out, such as what you see on Hitsugu's Second Right or Brothers Yamazaki. The next thing that's a little bit different about Mindbreak Trap is that it does not counter spells. It exiles them. Now, that means exactly what it sounds like. To exile a spell means to move it off of the stack and into the exile zone. If you're thinking that sounds basically the same as countering, you're right, but basically the same isn't exactly the same, and that small difference has some big consequences. Anything that keys off of a spell being countered will not care if you Mindbreak Trap something, and that includes spells that say they can't be countered. Mindbreak Trap can exile those spells just fine. So far, there's nothing that says a spell can't be exiled, so no spell is safe. This is sort of similar to how you can deal with an indestructible creature by exiling it, even though you can't destroy it. The last thing that I wanted to highlight about this is that Mindbreak Trap can exile any number of target spells. A lot of the time, this will just be one specific problem spell, but not necessarily. The variable number of targets can lead to some interesting questions. For example, 0 is a number. If you really needed a prowess trigger or a card draw with Archmage of Runes, you could just cast a Mindbreak Trap with no targets. This trick wouldn't work if you were going to use something like this counterspell because it requires a target. If there is no spell for it to target, it is not legal to cast counterspell. On the other hand, let's say that you had targeted 1 spell. In this case, Mindbreak Trap has a single target, and would therefore itself be a valid target for a spell like this Misdirection. If you targeted 2 or more spells, or 0 spells, the Mindbreak Trap would not have the correct number of targets to be misdirected, but if you choose exactly 1, it would. Let's observe that the English word single implies that there is one and only one, so it serves the same sort of purpose as exactly in the examples that I was talking about earlier. Templating fans might also be interested to know that WotC seems to prefer single when talking about targets, but exactly when talking about permanents. Maybe this is because things that care about the number of targets usually only proc on 1, whereas there's more variety for permanent-based effects. Or maybe WotC just thought a single creature read kind of weird. But I thought that was interesting. So maybe you're wondering, if that's the case, maybe you should intentionally try to target multiple spells with Mindbreak Trap to shield yourself from cards like Misdirection. And if you watched my video on casting spells, maybe you have an idea about how to do that. Since Mindbreak Trap itself is a spell on the stack at the time when you're choosing targets, what if you targeted Mindbreak Trap itself in addition to the spell that you wanted to exile? And at first glance, that looks like a great tactic. Unfortunately, the fun police are ready to step in and break it up. It is not legal for a spell on the stack to target itself, so this trick is not possible. If you really wanted to play around Misdirection, you could cast a sacrificial spell of your own before you cast Mindbreak Trap. Now that way there would be an additional spell to target. There's one last trick that I wanted to cover, and it has to do with changing targets. Here's an example scenario that illustrates the point nicely. Amy attacked with Atali and cast 4 spells. Nick then casts a Mindbreak Trap for free in order to exile all 4. Amy wants to save her spells with a Reverberate. Is this possible? Now, if we were just talking about a normal run-of-the-mill counterspell instead of Mindbreak Trap, this is a pretty well-known trick that people use all the time. Amy plays Grizzly Bears, Nick plays a counterspell against it, Amy plays Reverberate and copies Nick's counterspell, changing the copy's target from her Grizzly Bears to Nick's counterspell. Nick's counter is then countered, and Amy gets her Grizzly Bears. Great. Unfortunately, there's one additional wrinkle that makes the Mindbreak Trap scenario a little bit more complicated. Reverberate says you can choose new targets for the copy, but it doesn't let you change anything else. The number of targets is therefore set at the same as however many were chosen for the original spell. When choosing new targets, Amy cannot choose new targets that would be illegal. This means Amy will not be able to save all 4 of her spells. The original Mindbreak Trap has 4 targets, so Amy's copy must have 4 targets also. It is not legal to choose the same target multiple times unless the word target appears more than once. Therefore, Amy must choose 4 separate targets for her copy of Mindbreak Trap. Nick's own Mindbreak Trap is an obvious first choice. Amy's own Reverberate is still on the stack at the time this is happening, and therefore it is a valid second target. As we noted before though, Amy's Mindbreak Trap cannot target itself, meaning that the other 2 targets must come from among the spells Amy was trying to save. As Amy's Mindbreak Trap copy resolves, the game will note that the Reverberate has finished resolving and is therefore no longer on the stack. At this point, it's already been moved to Amy's graveyard. The other 3 targets are still legal though, so Nick's Mindbreak Trap and whatever 2 spells Amy sacrificed will be exiled. Then, the 2 remaining spells that Amy hit off Atali will resolve normally. Pretty cool scenario, right? Now let's close out with a couple of challenge questions to test your understanding. First up, we'll say that Amy plays 4 spells with Atali and then Nick uses Mindbreak Trap against all 4. How many tokens would Nick get with his Lol Mage Mentor if this all goes through? And the answer is 0. Remember, exiling does not count as countering, even though it's basically the same thing. In case you were wondering, if Nick actually had countered those spells with, like, Reverse the Polarity or something similar, that would be 4 instances of a spell Nick controls countering a spell. So that would mean Lol Mage Mentor would trigger 4 times. Alright, finally, what if Amy played 3 spells, and so Nick plays a Mindbreak Trap for free in order to exile one of them? Can Amy counter Mindbreak Trap with a minor misstep? And the answer here is no. Remember, even though Nick paid an alternative cost, the mana cost and mana value of his spell are the same as they normally are. The spell's mana value is therefore too high to be countered by minor misstep. Well, what if Amy had a Nyx? And so for this example, let's notice that Nyx says to counter the spell if no mana was spent to cast it. Unlike minor misstep, Nyx does not care about the mana value. It just wants to know how much mana was actually spent. This means Nyx would be able to counter Mindbreak Trap. If Nick really wanted to play around that specific card, he can. The alternative cost on Mindbreak Trap is actually worded such that it's optional. If Nick really wanted to, he could pay the normal mana cost of 2 and 2 blue, even if an opponent has cast 3 spells that turn. Pretty cool trick, right? And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.